Toi fatalo fatu mo falo lo fa fonga le tinu ma fa tasima le afionga pista Barbara Edmonds. Ye te novo I tulango paketi o iole so upule tulango o tap tupe ale parti le leipa. Yeah, fatalo fatu lo fionga pista and congratulations, the first time we met since you had your honorary title bestowed upon you.
Yeah, malo lesi for manuia. Yeah, thank you so much. It's good to be back. Yeah, it's been a busy year.
I know, and busy time too.
Yeah, really busy. We've just, the government of New Zealand had their budget yesterday. So it's been a very busy 24 hours trying to do a lot of media and getting around to different people to talk to them. But it's the assessment I'm getting from people I'm talking to, it's not a very good budget.
Right. Then let's have a look and see what do you make of it, and then we'll come to see the impact on Pacific.
Yeah.
Yes.
So ultimately, probably the big key item is that the government has managed to save, or we say cut, almost $13 billion from pay equity changes. So pay equity is the money that was set aside to pay women, or mainly women, in sectors which have been undervalued because so many women work in that sector. So a really good example is aged care sector. You know, a lot of our family works in the hospices and the retirement villages. It's a predominantly woman workforce.
Yes.
So the government, by cutting almost $13 billion yesterday in the budget, there was 33 claims. So plunket nurses, hospice nurses, teachers, so many who basically the government said a week ago, well, we're going to cut your claims overnight. They just put the legislation through and they cut it overnight. So this is where that $13 billion has come from. So the budget yesterday is the government saying we're going to pay for this by cutting women's pay.
And that's the 13 is over 4 years, not just the 1 year.
Yeah, it's over 4 years.
Yeah.
But again, those are we have a large number of Pacific women, particularly our Samoan community. A lot of people that have been talking to media have been Pacific people who are angry about this. And it really is, the government's made a choice that women are not worth the same as men in these areas.
Let me translate that in language. I don't know if I forgot know a little for my hotel. Onisi vai ngol tatu tanonga lela alanga I level team la failing ngana pirtania ye no fa li o tole steam mo ai le mo la no male fiong fo ya pista ese tatala no package el malo ye o lela tong fo ya tulvanga mo le tu pe se fene o le sul tesimal valu biliona pe sul tol biliona ye pe o se tu pe o se fe mai ina o ta fia to tong yo tangata I misheli tu pa to my time. E te tongi maua lalo. Sa pa sia whainga malo le leipa. Ia le wo mai le malo lea whai le pasi le tūla whono i ana whaitaunga lono e tolu. E leo pa sia le wo mai whama o sewe male tupele ia a le o le tongi ena I tangata ia e tolu sfulu tolu i mo meo whea ngainga o le o tau wha mau tū. Ia le o tau whia o maun tū ranga na. I just apologize. We got to do the rest of our interview in English so that we can. But I'll just cover the key things that we want to cover. Where the saving and who's losing out on this. All right. So, what other areas of the budget do you think it changes that it does not have a great impact from your viewpoint?
Another really big change is Kiwi Saver.
Yeah. So
now, if you have a Kiwi Saver account. From next year, that's your contribution is increasing to 3.5%, and the year after that to 4%. Your employer will match that. That'll be the minimum rate for Kiwi Saver. If you can't afford the 4%, the government says, well, you can go to 3%, but your employer has to stay at 4%. So it's good that the government wants to encourage people to save. However, the problem is that if you met a certain amount each year, the government would give you a contribution of just over $500. The government has now cut that in half, so to just over $250. So effectively, what that cut to the government contribution. So your employer pays something, I pay something and the government pays something, the government is saying, no, we're going to give you less. If you earn over 180,000, the government won't give you anything. But ultimately, if you're 18 and you've entered into Kiwi Saver, we calculate it as around $66,000 from the loss of that government contribution. So net, you'll be okay because you've increased your contribution, the employer, the employees increased it, but ultimately you would have more if the government had put the same amount in each year for you. So that's a big, good in some ways, but then they've taken away in others.
Right. What's your view about the youth 18, 19 not getting benefit?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting change. It's basically saying if your parents can afford to, then they should pay for you to, pay for you until you're 20. The problem with that though is when we're saying in our society, when you're 18, you're an adult. We're saying that you are able to vote, you are able to drink alcohol, you're able to go to clubs, etc. Except for the fact that the government now is saying, for whatever circumstance, you're not applicable for a benefit unless your parents, they test your parents' affordability.
Right.
But the flawed argument with that is that, when the Minister of Finance yesterday in her budget press conference, somebody asked her, why are you doing this change? And she said, I've been speaking to some mums and they say, can you help me get my 18-year-old off the couch? Well, I don't know whether the Minister of Finance was going to say to them, well, yeah, we will get them off the couch and you can pay for by you paying for it. So, I mean, it's there's an irony there in the sense that we're treating 18, 19-year-olds as adults, except for the fact that they can't access social support when they need it.
Yes, the infrastructure bill, especially the roading, seems to be a lot of money going to that.
So every time you put Bingsingi in your car, there's a levy that you pay, a tax that you pay as part of it, and that goes into a pool of money, and that money then gets planned, it gets spent on roads or whatever. Labour would also include public transport into that. There's actually a very big hole in the government's roading budget. There's about $6 billion. So again, there's lots of holes as to where money is being put. But the government had no problem. Just on Tuesday, they cancelled the tax that we were going to put on digital media service, digital tech giants. So we had that bill in. It was going to bring in $500 million, and then the government have said on Tuesday, oh no, we're not going to proceed with that. They gave the $2.9 billion for landlords or for people that have more than one house. Interest deductibility. They've given almost $260 million for tobacco companies. Yesterday, they gave $200 million to the gas companies. So again, it seems to be that there's money for all these other people, but if you're in low income or you're a family, there's not much money there for you. So yesterday's budget also gave, through Working for Families, around 142,000 families get $7 extra a week under Working for Families. But what the Minister of Finance didn't say yesterday in her speech is that 61,000 families will be losing, on average, $43 a fortnight. So that's $21.50 a fortnight. So some families will get $7 in the hand, others will lose $21.50. That comes in at around $100,000.
Yes.
But that's two low-income workers' families, If you're on 50K and I'm on 50K, then ultimately we're going to lose $21.50 a week. It's hard. So, it's a real... for me, I think this has been a real attack on working people and people who are of low incomes to pay for things like smoking, landlords, tech giants, and it's just, it's all about choices.
And the implication on families now and the cost of living.
Well, $7, that's not even enough to buy a block of butter.
Yeah,
our families know that. It's not even enough. And now they're saying, but for some of you families, because you're rich, even though you don't really earn that much if you're on too low incomes, they're saying, oh, well, we'll just take away a whole meal from you.
Impact on Pacific.
Yeah, this is really, really sad to see. So we have seen, again, after following last year's budget, and I just want to make sure I get those numbers right. So last year's budget, there was $26 million that was taken from the Ministry of Pacific Peoples. This year, there is now another 36 million that's been cut from them. So 22 million is from Tupu Aotearoa.
Yeah.
So that program, which gets delivered here by some of our organisations like Partners Porirua, that program helps Pacific people get into work. You know, sometimes things like licensing, CVs, etc. So that 22 million's gone. They've also taken away one of my budget initiatives, which was $14 million. That's the Tauola Business Fund. The business fund was to help Pacific people who aspire to be business people who can meet certain criteria, different grants, and to help them hire people. So it was going to create jobs. They've also cut almost $1 million from the Dawn Raids Research Fund. So, you know, that's a total of $36 million this year, $26 million last year. And then they've also cut almost $7 million from Pacific Education. You know, that was Pacific Education was to help our Pacific families run programs for them to understand how NCA works, etc. So it's been a really bad, again, Pacific people. Māori initiatives had $1 billion taken off them yesterday. It's just another attack again on low-paid workers, Pacific people, Māori people. But you can have $7 in the hand, or maybe.
Yeah, it's a bit hard, you know, to... obviously, some of these projects have been... You have people being employed to do this work. And now when you get a cut like this...
It's more jobs gone.
Yeah.
You know, unemployment is now set to rise under this government. It's higher. So when Labour left office in the 2023 election, basically, you know, again, unemployment was to hit the top end was 5.1. This is going to hit 5.4 this year, so they think 5.4% unemployed. What that is really for Pacific people is for those who are of working age, it's 1 in 10 Pacific people will be unemployed. So based on the figures yesterday in budget, that's an additional 22,000 people on the unemployment benefit. So this is all about the choices they make. So if people can't spend money, then businesses don't have customers.
Correct.
If they don't have customers, then they shut down. So you lose tax from the businesses, you lose tax from the people that have lost their wages, and then you have to pay out money in the benefit. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and that's quite evident in what's happening in Wellington.
Yes. And that's because, I mean, that's mainly the public sector jobs,
Correct.
but the public sector jobs flow on to everything in Wellington.
Right.
You know, the retailers, the construction, the hospitality. The really key thing as well is that right across the country, the government has stopped major builds of schools and hospitals and etc. and homes. Big thing is homes. Like we have here in Mana, you know, we've been talking for years about all the good housing that's happening. Yeah, they've all been cut. So what that means, though, is not only we have less houses, we have, you know, schools who are waiting for money to do their builds. It means that all the people that work on those projects, the plumbers, the electricians, the builders, the engineers, lots of them have lost their jobs. There's now 13,000 less construction sector jobs now in the country from last year. And this just shows this is what happens when the government stops spending, then the whole, you know, the economy drops. Yeah.
One of the things I've been thinking with New Zealand, everybody want to spend a certain amount of money to meet what we see as, I guess, equitable and that. But then where does the money come from?
Yeah. Ultimately, it comes from taxes, but it also comes from people, and those taxes come from people spending money, comes from people, working. That's where all that money comes from. So it's a really good point that you've made. You know, we need to ask ourselves as a country, what is the society we want for us or our kids? Do we want them to own their first home? Do we want to have good jobs? Do we want them to access healthcare, like their GP or their hospital if they need it? And if we do, then we have to work together to pay for it.
Correct.
That's ultimately what it comes down to. And, you know, this is why New Zealand, we say record net migration. That we've had more people, basically a plane load of leaving New Zealand every day, almost 200 people leaving every day on average, have left New Zealand to go elsewhere to find work, to get a house, to get the hospital, you know, the health needs they are. And that's why we're having record net migration leaving New Zealand. There's nothing here for them. What's the hope, you know?
And then most of them go to Australia?
Yeah, and they're doing, you know, they can buy a home. And I've got so many of my families that left, you know, sort of the mid-2000s, you know. I remember John Key was accused of the brain drain at the time. Yeah, we had a lot of family leave at that time and go to Australia, and they all managed to buy their own homes. You know, that's the difference. You can save over in Australia. You can buy your first home. But then you know, when I talk to businesses and they say, you know, we're losing workers to Australia, I also say to them, yeah, we're losing them because Australia pays better.
Yes.
You know, it's the work conditions that attract people to go there. So they want to go to Australia where they feel valued, they can earn more, and that's why Australia knows. That's why they're doing these ads here in New Zealand to take our teachers, take our doctors, take our police. So it feels like we've just been training a whole bunch of people for them to just basically be taken away by Australia. But they're choosing to, and you don't blame them because they need that support.
Yes. Is there any part of the budget you think that was unnecessary?
Oh, a whole bunch of it, really. Yeah. I mean, you know, again, the $200 million for gas subsidies. We have not found any gas in New Zealand for the last 25 years. And so, you know, Shane Jones, you know, Shane Jones or New Zealand First gave $200 million to do more gas exploration. The issue with that, though, is we have climate change. You know, there's a reason why we're trying to move away from gas is because the way that it impacts on the environment. And that's why we're trying to electrify more, you know, use more electricity, you know, you know, New Zealand First are trying to say we're trying to address the energy prices, you know, because it goes up and it goes down. There are other ways to do that than exploring gas because it's shown 25 years there's been no gas.
Why didn't they give the 20 million subsidy? Or
200 million.
Why didn't they give the full subsidy for putting on solar panels?
Yes, well, that's a good question. You know, it could have been solar panels, it could have been, you know, increases in the winter energy payment. But, you know, dealing with the things as to why energy prices are patchy as they are. But, you know, that's this government, they want to give it to the gas subsidies. So, again, they're giving money to people that don't need it, the gas companies, tobacco companies, the landlords. You know, they're giving those tax cuts to them and the big giant tech companies, but they're taking away from everyday New Zealanders, and in particular, the 13 billion, close to $13 billion was taken away from predominantly women who are low paid. That's not fair, and it's, you know, so we would, like, the Labour Party will keep fighting for this.
So the current deficit, and obviously if we were spending a lot of money more than what you're making, that deficit will keep improving.
Yeah, well, it gets bigger. Yeah,
bigger.
So there's growing deficit. And that comes down back to the choices this government made when they came in. So if you remember during the election, they promised a lot of people $250 tax cut. I don't know if you remember, I remember it very clearly, $250 tax cut. It's now come, you know, almost 18 months since they got elected. We've been asking them, well, how many family have received the $250 tax cut? They can't say. They can't give us a number. They don't actually know. So, you know, that's lies. They lied and they said we can give you $250 tax cut. So that package, that and the tax cuts, that package cost $14 billion. Last year they borrowed $12 billion. This year they borrowed $7 billion. And so they basically have borrowed just over $60 billion in total in the last two budgets. Labour borrowed about $118 billion in the 6 years we were in. But remember, we had COVID and we had a cyclone and you know, and those floods in Auckland. This government has basically borrowed a lot of money for their tax cuts and, you know, for the things, their projects, but we don't see the value of it, because I'm pretty sure if you ask people, how's your tax cut going, they wouldn't have seen it because the price of because inflation has eaten it up.
Two things I wanted you to explain for our listeners. Operating allowance, what's that?
Yeah, so the operating allowance, so obviously, the budget is, basically everything that you have, the government spends all its money, so it's choices. The operating allowance is money that is set aside for new initiatives. So the government had said last year that it's going to be 2.4. They cut that this year to 1.3. So that's only new spending. So it's not all the total spending. Right. But as you see, the reason why they could drop that to 1.3 was because they were taking 13 billion off women.
Yeah. And then they borrowed. And then the deficit.
The deficit is basically, what the government gets in. So it's income coming in or revenue coming in minus its expenses. So that's effectively, and then the rest over is basically, that's how big the deficit is. That's how much your overdraft is.
Yeah, and then the borrowing. I think it was heading towards over 30%.
Yeah.
What is the comfortable level that we can afford to go to?
So the measurement. So currently debt based on the budget. So when the government or any government does a budget, we look over the forecast. What we say forecast period. So over the 4 years ahead. So debt as a percentage of GDP. So core crown net debt as a percentage of GDP will climb to 46%.
Right.
When ultimately, Treasury is saying 50% is probably the most comfortable we could borrow without sort of it basically meaning that you might not have enough if there's a natural disaster. But that's kind of their guidelines is around 50%.
But you look at countries like Japan and the States, trillions.
Yeah, well, Japan is, the same with Japan is over 200% debt. And, the US and other countries are over 100% debt. They, in many ways, can borrow more because they're bigger economies and they have, bigger economies. Japan, however, the thing that, I asked some economists recently, I said to them, why is it that Japan can borrow, 200%, have been 200% debt? Aren't the people worried about that? And the responses I got back was really interesting. And their view was Japan doesn't look at debt the same way New Zealanders do. And they said, as long as it's debt to the Reserve Bank of Japan or the Federal Bank of Japan, they're fine because that's money that's in Japan. It's when you start borrowing and releasing government bonds to offshore, that's different debt. So their internal debt, so the money they're borrowing off their Reserve Bank, that is high, but their external debt, the money they owe to other people, is very low. So the US, though, however, has a lot of money they owe, and they owe a lot of money to China. So this is why Japan has a very different view of debt, the way that New Zealand does. But anybody that goes to Japan, you see the services they have, the transport systems they have, the health systems that they have. If New Zealand wants to have these good things, then like Chippy and Chris Hipkins, my boss, and myself have been saying, then let's have a proper conversation about debt. Because the way that the National Party talk about debt, it's a very, very, very bad thing, but they only look at it in isolation. Any business person knows you look at the full balance sheet. What's your assets? What's your liabilities? What's your expenses? How much money you got coming in, and then how much you have to borrow. So you look at it in totality. So I suspect when National Party, in 2023 said that Labour was putting New Zealand into debt, it's going to create a headache for our children. In some respects, yes, money is going to have to be paid back. But the way that Labour had put in our plan for the election, it was very measured. We would come back to surplus within 4 years. But we had to do that because we had to save lives during COVID, 20,000 lives that, estimated we saved. And the advice that we got at the time is that if we didn't put in the wage subsidy, which is about $60 billion, we hadn't put that money in to help employers and employees stay connected, we would have had unemployment the size of Palmerston North. That's a big city. Imagine them all unemployed. That's what was on our hands. So, yes, we had to increase debt, but we were very careful. We had surpluses all the way before. Labour governments have had 11 surpluses when we were in. And that just shows we are careful budget, managers of the budget. Except when it came to COVID and the cyclones, we had to make sure we borrowed to keep people alive, to fix things and keep people employed.
No, I think it's almost like you need an educational program to make people understand the definition of what we're trying to achieve here, so that people will then say, yeah, I can now vote for that because I understand what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, and that's what it comes down to ultimately. We that what we take to the next election, we need to be able to have time to spend time with people to help them understand why we're doing what we're doing. So this budget, we had this budget, we've got next year's budget. From next year's budget, I will put together the fiscal plan or the plan for Labour and how we're going to spend money and bring money in. And that's what we need to start talking to people right now, to start educating them about, these are the trade-offs we have to make. If you want a world-class train system, if you want a world-class health system, then we're going to need to pay for it. So let's have a conversation about how we do that.
I've been watching budgets since 1970.
Yeah.
And what I can see, this 3-year cycle, they come in and do certain things. And then maybe midway through the term, they will come with budgets like this. And then next year they splash out and impress all the voters, or almost like buying the votes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair, accurate description of it, when Labour first came in 2017, we had a families package, that was, close to a $200 increase a fortnight for some families. And that actually was an increase for some families. So, every political party will time when they do these particular things. But I think for this year, the key thing for this year's budget is the government have cut women's pay to pay for all these other things. And again, for our Pacific communities, this is our mothers and aunties who work in these industries, early childhood, as nurses, as teachers, as in those aged care facilities. So it's really disappointing to see. But, that's the hard work I've got ahead of me to try and turn that around for us and give our people hope.
All the best and good luck.
Thank you.
And thank you for your time coming in today to share this with our listeners. E o tato por kalamena tatano fo ima Pesetatamalelagi Barbara Edmonds. E si taimi on whaare liwa toila ia po le asonga fua. Ia te mine ia mate whatofa.
Thank you.